Brian, thank you for joining me on the Emil podcast. I'm really glad to have you on board and to explore a whole bunch of different themes about brain health. But what I want to do to begin with is to give a bit of an introduction on who you are to our listeners who may not have heard of you and where they can find you and the rest of that. So to begin with, I just want to say that Ryan Morgan is a registered psychologist and postgraduate and has a lot of postgraduate training in non-medication based approaches for conditions such as sleep disorders or disturbances, ADHD, stress and burnout, depression, anxiety, as well as peak performance for students, athletes, and professionals. A lot of that work is done through the type of resourcing and the type of study and training that you've done previously. And you've also had a range of training in nutritional medicine, mental health, and brain health coaching, evidence-based neurotherapies. That's an interesting one that I'm sure we'll get into, as well as clinical hypnosis. So that's a really cool one. Ryan is one of Australia's only psychologists with skills in areas of family business and wealth psychology, supporting high to ultra high net worth families to successfully transition their legacy to the next generation through preserving family relationships. This is all a lot of information that can be found on his website and to frame where he's coming from and the type of work that he does. But one of the things that captures me is that Ryan works in a way that frames current illnesses or considering current day illnesses stemming from the way we live, the things that we do, and the environment that we find ourselves in. He values the importance of the entire person taking an integrated and tailored approach. And that, I think, is what drew me to your work, Ryan. It's not a cookie cutter approach that you just slap on to everyone when they come to see you. It's a matter of deciding what it is that person is coming to see you for and developing a tailored approach. And that's why you established your company, Neuro Performance. And so I don't know whether I've missed anything there or whether you have something you'd like to add or take away from that brief introduction. So I'll leave it over to you, Ryan. Thank you for coming on board and chatting with me today.
No, I appreciate you having me, Emil. And yes, you've covered all the depth and breadth of my career and what I've explored and experimented with. So, yes, look, certainly my early career really was, in child abuse services, and I was a child abuse investigator. That's where I trained as a psychologist, and then within the disability sector. And so, I just found that the grounding there was so helpful. And then, of course, I moved into Centrelink as a Centrelink psychologist, where you would be doing a lot of assessments on individuals who had previously been undiagnosed, and certainly, there were a multitude of untreated schizophrenics. And so you really got to see sort of mental health at the coalface. And even as a practicing psychologist, over many, many years, you just get to see some of the shortfalls in some of our therapies. I mean, talk therapy is vital. It's certainly evidence-based. But the percentage of individuals that would often come to me going, I've tried this, I've tried cognitive therapy, this doesn't work, that doesn't work for me. So all throughout my career, I think I've always suspected that there's more to this journey, or there's more to the story of mental health, and very quickly became, a believer in getting rid of the term, mental health or mental illness, and adopting the term brain disorder, because I think the evidence is compelling that the bulk of these mental illnesses we're talking about are brain disorders. And so unless we're looking to actually firstly see and identify this brain disorder, and that's not just through a questionnaire, we need to look at the actual brain to see what this kind of disorder is, and then be guided by that to select the treatments, and not just fit you into a box. You fit this label, you're ADD, therefore here's your one treatment. It's
Yeah.
old. It's old science. It served us, but it's old. And I just think there's a new way. And so, so that long journey, I think, convinced me to start to seek and adopt other tools. And so certainly neuroscience is the area, and epigenetics or genetics is an area that has started to identify these biological markers behind these brain disorders and guide treatment planning.
This is huge. It's such a breath of fresh air to look and to hear where you're coming from. My mind goes to some of the neuroscientists in the States, one of which you may have heard of, Dr. Andrew Huberman, who runs the Huberman Lab. And he's all about how do we integrate current knowledge into very practical and behavioral interventions that will work for you, and that has been shown to be quite helpful. And it takes a special kind of therapist or practitioner to be able to say, hey, this is what I've been trained. This is where it's served me. This is where the gaps are, and let's try to find a new way. Because you would attest to this, perhaps. Not everyone's like that. They get the degree and then they go on their way and treat what they've been taught. And I want to understand from your point of view, because this is new territory for me. I'm very interested in this sort of stuff. I love learning a little bit more about the neuroscience of getting better, but also what lies behind that, and how are we able to conceptualize oneself. So if you were to give a compelling case on why it's important to consider the brain in terms of a person's individual psychology and what it is that they do in their day-to-day, why is understanding the brain so important?
Look, I actually think it's even more beyond just understanding the brain. To your earlier point, we are all trained in a very narrow specialty. Medicine's probably the model from which we've all mimicked our training. You have a cardiologist and an endocrinologist, and all these doctors specialize in just one area. It's needed because there's such an amount of knowledge for, say, a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist or an educational. You just can't be across it all. But I think what's been left out of that training and what's been narrowing our focus is that, and this is still within all the medical textbooks at university training, and I think it still is in most of our psychology, is we are not a single system. We're not just a brain or just a heart or just a liver. They are all interconnected. If your liver goes out, you are going to have consequences in most of your other organs. Okay. If your gut health goes out, we now know you are guaranteed to have issues in your brain. If you have a brain-based issue or a mental health condition called, stress, acute stress, or, ongoing stress, you will likely develop gut issues. We're systems. And so I think when we just look at one aspect, we're limiting our ability to be in my view, successful in treating a patient. And certainly I don't argue that we should all go and train in all the things that I'm sort of trained in. I mean, these are my passions and interests, and there's a limit before it gets, overwhelming. But it's about being more aware of, in your assessments, that there are many other things that can be driving this issue. And I think to be better equipped to then refer on, to have different groups do these different aspects of the puzzle. I mean, a kind of multimodal system coming together would be the ideal. The reason I do most of these things myself is I just can't find anyone else in Australia really sort of interested in doing this. But in the US, this is exactly the model that is being built at clinics, where you will have an integrative specialist, you will have someone who just looks at brain spec scans and interprets them, or EEGs, and gives advice. You'll have the psychologist, you'll have the physical trainer, and they all come together to tailor a program that addresses all the systems that leads to that improved outcome. So it's a systems-based approach, that I'm really buying into, rather than just a brain-based approach. Okay, but why I'm a little biased to the brain is because we've got all the tools, and we've been looking at your heart and your gut and measuring your microbiome and taking blood samples. We've been doing that for ages. We're not looking at the brain. And that's always puzzled me. And, Dr. Amen, who runs the sort of Amen clinics in the US, and appreciate he's a controversial psychiatrist in many ways. But to his point, he said psychologists and psychiatrists are the only profession who never look at the organ they claim to treat. And, that's what drove him to look at SPECT blood flow scans, and what has led him to get the kind of outcomes he gets and publish them. He doesn't look at them in isolation. He doesn't argue that they should be looked at in isolation, but they give you such a large piece of the puzzle that when you put it into that bigger clinical intake context, can really change the trajectory of how you treat. So I'm bringing the brain into focus because, it's also the organ that uses almost 50% of the nutrients we ingest. And I don't think people realize, they focus on, I've got fatty liver, or, palpitations, or atrial fibrillation in the heart, or whatever. And they're noticeable conditions. But the brain uses more blood sugar than any other organ. It uses more nutrients than other organs. It is entirely dependent on oxygenation. It is entirely dependent on sleep. I mean, sleep is vital for it to function. So, it's just a piece, I think, of that puzzle that we've ignored. People will go and get their colon checkups, their prostate checkups, their breast cancer checkups. They do all these things. No one ever checks their brain. And then we wonder why, we've got this epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. It's now estimated in the next 5 to 10 years to hit between 50 and 60% of the population.
Wow.
That's
huge.
Striking. It's striking. And part of it is because we're just not looking at the brain, or we're looking at it incorrectly, and we're ignoring brain health in general. So, very much like Dr. Amen said, is, want to bring back the importance of our brain and the value of protecting the brain and looking after the brain. And our current lifestyles, as they are doing enormous damage. And I think we're just ignoring it.
There's so much there to unpack. One of the things that came up to me earlier on in your bit of, in discussing the integrative nature, or the required integrative nature of conceptualizing what someone's coming in to see a person for, a medical practitioner for. The field of psychoneuroendocrinology came to mind. Is this something that you're that encapsulates? I can see you nodding. Is this and if so, is this something that's just not being picked up here in Australia as much as in other places such as the US? And if that's the case, I can see you nodding again. Why do you suspect that is?
Lots to answer there. Absolutely. We're looking at hormones effectively in endocrinology, and acknowledging that things like estrogen in the male brain plays a vital role, an aspect that we don't focus on. In male and female brains, estrogen is vital for brain function. So when hormones go out, when thyroid goes out, the consequences are disastrous. And traditionally, it's just been very much separated. Back to that earlier point, it is about the hormone. I look at the hormone, I treat the hormone. I'm not looking at the other organs that it may be affecting. And so, yes, we certainly are. I mean, globally, I think we are much further behind, say, the US and Europe in bringing together these facets of endocrinology, or glucose management in ADHD, or even just simple deficiencies. ADHD, for example, people still class these nutritional supplements as alternative, which I think is a joke. There are 40 years of research, compelling research, to show that ADHD sufferers consistently come up with deficiencies in vitamin D3, omega, magnesium, zinc, and typically have high levels of copper. And so you look at that and go, well, if they consistently come up with them, and we've actually got explanations for how that actually affects the brain's functioning, how that changes neurotransmitters, why do we not look at correcting those? It's not the cure, but it's a part. It's a part of it. So I think it's more to your point that we're just still looking at everything in its isolation rather than going, well, how does that hormone change actually affect my brain health? Now, women in menopause, pre or post, will testify to this. Like, do we need more evidence? The brain fog, the depression, the consequences. If you look at the research from concussion, head injuries, changes hormones. And the consequences on the brain there have been well established. So it is almost ridiculous that we ignore it, but we have. I think we're just behind on the research. We're about 17 years behind on the research is what came out of the US. And, you now hear people here in Australia talking about that as well. And it's just old style, traditional styles of practice that people just don't want to move out of. It's comfortable. They just don't want to move out of it. Yeah.
I've heard some medical professionals say that there's certain practitioners who are waiting for the older generation of medical professionals to pass on before the next phase comes up. And then it generally happens from a generational perspective. And so it's 17 years. What's a generation? Is it 20 years or is it something 30 years?
Probably a little longer than that. Yeah. That transition out of one gen to another is probably going to be about a 30-year gap. So,
yes.
But, the thing is, we can't wait that long.
No.
Systems aren't working now, and we're failing people, I think, by and large, in the mental health space. There's an argument that we need to be bringing this now, even if there's going to be criticism, and certainly I face that. Doctors are not big referrers to me. I get most of my referrals through word of mouth, or people doing their own homework, or people who have actually gone to the US to do treatments there. Because for doctors, this is too threatening. You're a psychologist. How can you be dealing with technology like neurofeedback? How can you incorporate that, even though psychologists invented it and figured it out? There's an ignorance, there's a terrible ignorance out there to begin with. But I think there's also a turf war out there that's happening too. So many factors here that I think we've got to overcome if we're going to sort of move towards this model. Another thing, Emil, is this idea that you've got to have this kind of robust, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And, and I espouse to that. I was trained in that. We all are, and I'm not poo-pooing that. But what's come to light now is that they are highly flawed themselves. They are deeply misleading. They are so open to manipulation. And we're relying on those. So I think we've also got to move away from this. Does it have a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of 1,000 people to give us the power? If not, I'm not interested. I'm not going to employ it. We have to move beyond that. There are many, many arguments to show that if you've got well over 1,000 case studies that are well documented, that when you do get to doing that kind of a large-scale research trial, it just simply confirms it was well over 90% confirmation rate between the research trial and having 1,000 case studies. So do we even need, that kind of research is sort of some of the emerging arguments. So I think it's about trying to employ things that have good, reasonable evidence, that at least have a safety profile. And, in my practice, I certainly will suggest and offer and work with people to go through what we know we've got compelling evidence, but most of them are saying, I've done the CBT, I've done the antidepressants, I've done this, I've done that, done it for years, I'm not getting better, what else? And that's where we can say, well, let me at least inform you that although some of these are regarded maybe as experimental, they do actually have established research and they do have a safety profile. Are you willing to give it a go? And that's where people are open to it. And you start to see some remarkable results, in that space. So, it's not about being a cowboy. I think, some people will certainly think that. It's about definitely working within those boundaries of science. But I think we have enough to work with now that we can start employing in some of these areas. For example, genetics or epigenetics. You have enough evidence in the space of looking at gene data to work with someone. But yes, it has to be done within a particular context. So I'll give you a practical example.
Mm-hmm.
This trend of the methylation gene, the MTHFR gene, that became very, very popular. And now there were multiple companies just isolating out this, let's get you tested to see whether you carry one or two of the variants, in this particular gene. And if you do, we need to address it. We need to treat it and correct this over or under methylation in your genes, and all your mental health issues will be resolved. Now, there's a lot of truth in the methylation genes being identified and maybe over represented in that kind of clinical population. But it is also, these variants are also found in 60% of the population, and the vast majority of them don't suffer issues. So, so straight away you go, well, just because you identify it doesn't mean you do have an issue or likely to have an issue. So what we do in our world is we do blood tests. And so you would look at, if I carry this gene, I would expect that if I'm not methylating, that I would have a problem in either my homocysteine levels or in my whole blood histamine levels, because they are intimately involved in the whole methylation cycle that occurs in our body. And I'm using methylation as an example because it's probably the most significant functional process in the human body that's involved in DNA unwrapping and neurotransmitter production and you name it. So it's a vital function. When you do that blood test, if it comes up showing that a person has excessively high levels of histamine, whole blood histamine, you have that cross-confirmation that that particular gene is likely very active in that person, that variant, and causing those issues. So, every little thing that I talk about, whether it be genetics, even EEG, you don't take EEG as a standalone. You would take it, you would identify concerns, but you need to identify, are they manifesting in that person's life? Do they indeed have problems with their working memory or their auditory memory? And test that. And if you get that kind of cross-confirmation or validation, that's what gives you a far more specific and very accurate measure of, here's the problem, now we know what we need to address.
And just on your last point, an EEG is an electroencephalogram that it kind of electrodes on the human brain, on the scalp, sorry, not on the brain, and that measures brain activity. So for those who aren't aware of the acronyms here, it's another form of brain scanning or scanning brain activity.
Yes. To your point, yes.
Of course, we can jump into it quite deeply, but for what I would say is, one thing that's come up as you speak is the word maverick comes to mind when you were discussing how there are some clinicians, more so in the States, but not so in Australia, that take this more integrative approach. My personal experience here in Australia was when I've spoken to was one medical professional I spoke to, and I was discussing how I interviewed a ADHD specialist, but he's an integrative specialist by the name of Dr. James Greenblatt. And he talks all about what you've mentioned in terms of the nutritional deficiencies and the rest of that. And it just, the non-verbal responses from this medical professional was kind of like, well, that's just integrative medicine, which is very interesting because Dr. James Greenblatt is very widely respected, but he was very frustrated when I asked him what's been the most frustrating thing. He said the uptake in the psychiatric community, even in the States, isn't as forthcoming as it could be. But I want to focus. Perhaps I wonder whether here in Australia, and I've heard people say this, that in America there's more of a celebration of when somebody is going out and achieving things on their own, and when people do well, that's celebrated. Whereas in Australia, it's not as celebrated in terms of a cultural sense when an individual person is breaking the mold and is starting to do something new, something different, from a cultural perspective. I wonder, so Mavericks aren't seen, at least in Australia, as widely respected as those in the States. If something good comes out of Australia, we want to hold them into Australia rather than share them with anybody else. I wonder. I'm speculating here whether there's anything to do with uh, any of that that's going on as well, or whether it's just a matter of I'm just going to stick to what I know and that's about it. Because it is daunting to do something different.
Yeah, look, I think it's multifactorial. It's firstly it's a training issue. So say for example in that medical community, you've got a doctor commenting on integrative, which is effectively a word for nutrition. They're not trained in nutrition. They don't read the literature. They don't read the journals that have published the vast majority of outcomes on it. They do like a half a chapter within their sort of university studies. And this has been talked about by a multitude. So I think part of it is if it's not in your training, you tend to poo-poo it straight away. Okay? If it's not in your field, you tend to ignore it. I think we all do that to a degree, even in the sort of psychology world. I get similar responses. What you're doing is outside of my core training. We do talk therapy. That's what we trained in. That's all you do. And to your word, that might represent being a maverick because I've got these very narrow definitions of what it means to be a professional. And I think that's a shame. I think that's more around our ego and our identity than it is about science. And I think it fails patients to begin with. To be so ignorant fails patients. And that's been taken out of the equation. People say, oh, I only want the best for my patients. I think that's utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. On the other hand, granted, particularly within the medical community, they're very strictly governed by their association. If you work in a hospital, they traditionally signed agreements that said they will not advise or give advice on anything to do with nutrition or prescribe any nutritional supplements because that breaches their insurance. So, there is this stay within your training, stay within your field. So how can they? How can they work outside of that, even if they're interested or read all of that sort of research? It's very hard for them to implement it. So our society, our society as psychologists is maybe a little more broad. Having consulted with them before I sort of started employing all these different various aspects, such as nutritional medicine, into my practice, they were, as long as you can establish credibility, as long as you've got the credentials, as long as you're not, falsely advertising or overselling, outcomes and things like that, you're within your practice scope. That's okay. So I think they're a little more willing to have a psychologist trained more broadly, whereas that's very limiting in the medical field. So number one, I think certainly, we do have that other sort of kind of attitude here, maybe, which we're not as open. But quite frankly, I think to James Greenblatt's point, it's the same in the US. Dr. Amen suffered and still suffers enormous criticism from his medical counterparts. Dr. Mark Hyman, who's a very well-respected integrative GP or physician, this man is on top of the research. He quotes the research. It's great quality research, yet he still comes under enormous criticism because what he talks about doesn't fit the paradigm. Okay. I'll give you another example. I find this really interesting. So just over the last 2 weeks, some information came out about Alzheimer's research. And for a very long time, Alzheimer's has focused on beta amyloid plaque is the cause of Alzheimer's in the brain. despite growing evidence to the contrary that it is the cause of Alzheimer's, that dogma continued. And so recently, a drug was released in the US, and I can't recall the name, and it was released and approved by the FDA despite the fact that a large proportion of the panel said, we have deep concerns about the side effects of this drug. They still approved it because there is nothing that works for Alzheimer's. None of the drugs work. Some of the ones on the market now have been shown to potentially increase or speed up the sort of that degradation process. Anyway, long story short, is what was found was that the primary researcher on whose paper this drug was based has just been found out to be a fraud. So he fraudulently manipulated imagery to show a condition in the brain to look far worse than it actually was. So he has edited and changed the images to justify his research paper, and they've used that paper to build this particular drug. Now, this is now public. This has come out. There's all the questions around what are going to be the consequences. And despite that, and despite them saying there is no evidence for this issue, there are still foundations there that believe wholeheartedly beta amyloid plaque causes this issue, and we're not going to move away from this. And so some of the people being interviewed in the space were asked, why is that? And they've gone, because there's too much on the line. There's too much money. There's too much investment. They've gone down this rabbit hole. How do you get out of it? You know, they believe their dogma, even though it's not proven. I think we all suffer from that issue. I mean, as psychologists, we work on that, don't we, as changing beliefs, you know, that let's try and find the evidence to challenge your beliefs. And if there's overwhelming evidence, then maybe you need to shift your belief. So no one's immune. But I mean, this is the issue. This is the aspect that's driving our one-line approach, and why I think we're not looking outside of that to, well, what else out there is potentially working? And in a sense, let the evidence guide what we do. So yeah, James is right. I think he's a remarkable psychiatrist. I mean, he's got 40 years of outcomes that he publishes in the work that he does. In Australia, if you are a psychiatrist and you claim that you're integrative, be aware you will come under enormous attack. I have a lot of colleagues who practice that and say they do the bare minimum and they don't advertise it because they'll come under attacks. They'll have complaints made to the psychiatry board from their colleagues, and they will have to go and defend themselves in what they're doing.
Who wants that?
Yes, exactly. So if you know that you're going to come under that kind of attack, why would you want to step into it? So
Ryan,
tough gigs. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Ryan. And I think you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I do appreciate, I could sit here speaking for hours longer. I think we've just scratched the surface of the surface here. And I want to leave our listeners, if there's anything that you've missed, anything that you feel like you need to communicate a little bit more, is there anything at all that comes to mind as we close today?
Yeah, look, I think for me it's about, if you really are sincere about recovering from whatever issue you're struggling with, is to move outside of the space that there is one thing that will fix it. That the answer lies in a pill, or the answer lies in a supplement, or the answer lies just in changing my diet. People try these little different things. It didn't work. They abandon it. They move on to the next thing. They tried and abandon it. If I can leave your listeners with one thing, and that is, we're a system. We can't just try and change one thing in isolation. We need to be employing strategies across a broad range of areas at the same time, so that you get this global synergistic approach that comes in to help our body and our brain heal. So I have a silly little acronym that maybe I'll leave them with, which is out of my word, neuro performance. It's my neuro program, NEURO. And really, I encourage most of mine to build strategies out in each one of those quadrants. So the N stands for nutrition. Yes, it's vital. It is take out of your body the toxins that you're putting in. That includes smoking marijuana daily, if anyone thinks that that's a helpful thing to do. It's extremely toxic on the human brain. So nutrition is about taking out the bad, putting back in the good, and feeding your body the nutrients so that your brain gets those nutrients. And yes, you may need to do responsible, targeted supplementing based on some blood tests, based on some investigations. Okay. The E stands for exercise, stands to reason. We still have remarkable evidence that exercise will reduce the ADHD symptoms up to 50%. We know exercise still outperforms most antidepressants when it comes to depression. So we need to be moving. Exercise is protective against that cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. So the U stands for unwinding, and I think this is a major thing, is we are all so connected to technology 24/7, to these horrific stories on the news, to working on our laptops in bed at night. Priority needs to be, you have to unwind. You have to disconnect from technology and from the kinds of stresses driving us. I think stress management is deeply important. The R is restorative sleep, and probably I wish that was right at the beginning, but if you're not sleeping, you're never going to recover. One of the world's largest studies, published a couple of months ago, that followed preteen and teenagers over their lifespan into adulthood, they have concluded, and we've known this, but they've concluded that preteen and teenage sleep issues, which is sleep less than 9 hours, is predictive of mental illness in adulthood. Predictive, because it changes the networks within the human brain. Okay.
Wow. Okay, that's
it's
significant.
Huge. It's huge. And sleep is so under focused on in a way. Yet, if you want to just get a cognitive gain the next day, sleep, and you'll improve your cognitive. We've taken adolescents, we've taken army soldiers, and we've taken them from their 7.5, 8.5, or 9 hours. We've reduced them down to 6, and we've reduced their cognitive functioning by up to 50%. One night, after one night. So, sleep is vital. So restorative sleep becomes important. And then sort of the final O is optimize, optimizing the brain. And this is where we can do things like using the various neurotechnologies that are emerging, using things like neurofeedback, which is a non-invasive therapy, not a treatment, it's a therapy. It's a brain training therapy for the brain. It has evidence, good evidence, not for everything. It's not a panacea. We've got emerging evidence for things like pulsed electromagnetic frequency. We have got rapidly emerging evidence for a thing called photobiomodulation, which is near-infrared and infrared treatment for the brain itself to reduce inflammation, improve concussion, showing great promise in Parkinson's, great promise in Alzheimer's disease. Okay, the Florey Institute, for example, is really looking into photobiomodulation. So, there are many others. We obviously will run out of time if we go through, but there are emerging technologies to optimize the brain. There are emerging therapies in genetics to learn how to optimize your genetics. There are emerging treatments coming out of the peptide world, which is just a simple word for protein, an amino acid protein. That is showing in Russia, they use a nasal spray for ADHD. They refuse to prescribe Ritalin or Dexies. So, they need a bit more evidence, but they are certainly emerging. And so I think there are other things we can do to optimize our brain and just improve that performance as well. So that's NEURO. If we're building different strategies out in all of those, I'd be very surprised if you didn't improve your functioning dramatically. Very, very surprised. Every time I've seen a client do that, the successes have been enormous. When clients and patients do one or two and they fall away from the others, a little bit of a shift. I wouldn't accept that shift. I'd want more. So it's hard work. And I agree, it's hard work. And so I just want to leave your listeners with that is be prepared to put in the effort, be prepared to work for between 6 and 12 months to get all of these strategies in place. But I don't think you'll ever look back if you do it. Yeah.
What a wonderful place to leave this podcast. That neuro acronym is going to stick with me. I'm going to incorporate that to my clinical practice as well, and make sure I make the proper references to that, Ryan. I do appreciate that. If our listeners did want to know and learn a little bit more about you, perhaps reach out to you, ask you questions, get involved, facilitate a referral for any medical professionals, what's the best place to catch you on?
Yeah, sure. I think just popping on my website, Neuro Performance, there's some helpful stuff there. It's always evolving. I'm still sort of building that out, but there's a lot of information in there already to sort of give you an idea of what I do. My email address is on there as well, info@neuroperformance.com.au, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. So a lot of people will pop me emails just to sort of ask a couple of questions. I do also occasionally, I have these sort of early morning calls. So between 8:30 and 9, you can jump on my website and there's just a little complimentary call sort of section there. You can book an appointment in the morning. We'll have a quick intro chat just to see, because I'm not suitable for everyone and not all patients are suitable to work with me. And I think that's a really helpful way for us to suss each other out, to make sure that we're compatible.
You've made a compelling case to look into this quite a lot now, or at least to move into another alternative. So I do appreciate this time that you've given so generously, and to open this up to those who may not have seen that there are other options out there, not just psychotherapy based on CBT or other types of therapies that you address. There's more to it than that, and we'll explore this as we go. But thank you so much, Ryan. I look forward to disseminating this information and doing my part as well.
Thanks, Emil. Appreciate your time.